Okay, guess I'm going to talk about supply-side economics. This is Dr. Kling, and 25 years ago, a classic movie came out.
Today, we have a similar debate over this. Anyone know what this is, class? Anyone? Anyone? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue as at this point. This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this in 1980? Anyone? Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics.
Okay. Okay. So, that's the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and the lecture that he was giving was on supply-side economics, and supply-side economics had only been a term for about 6 or 7 years at that point, and that may have ended it right then and there. It's really hard to talk about it after Ben Stein's wonderful lecture. It really is kind of this cultural phenomenon anyway. It was a cultural phenomenon even before. So I'll draw this, the infamous Laffer curve. This is tax revenue on this axis, and this is the tax rate on this axis. And the idea is, well, how much revenue would you get if you had a zero tax rate? Well, you'd get nothing. And how much revenue would you get if you have 100% tax rate? Well, again, you'd get nothing, because nobody would work if all their efforts were going to the government. And so you draw this curve that says, well, presumably somewhere between 0 and 100% taxes, you get some maximum revenue. And the thinking is, if you happen to have started out on this side, wherever, we don't know where this peak is it at 80%, is it at 20%, wherever, we don't know where it is, but if you happen to be on this side, you can cut tax rates and raise tax revenue. And that's what people were promising in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I don't think it worked. Most people don't think it worked, but it was sort of tried. Another way to think about supply-side economics, though, is in our aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework, P and Y. And let's put a short-run aggregate supply curve in there and a short-run aggregate demand curve in there. And what happens if the government cuts taxes by cutting tax rates? So it cuts the tax rate on income. What happens? The Keynesian story is that the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. So we get that. That's the Keynesian story. But the supply side story is different. Hang on a second. We magically make that line disappear. And the supply side story is that if you cut tax rates, you increase aggregate supply. So you get this guy. So you get the increase in aggregate supply. And that's the because as you cut tax rates, workers are more willing to work, capitalists are more willing to supply capital, and so you get this increase in supply. And in fact, if you believe this story, you not only would increase short-run aggregate supply, you would also shift long-run aggregate supply. So if we started like this, we would go to something like this. So both the Keynesian theory and the supply side theory predict that output will go up if you cut taxes. The Keynesian theory would say that prices will go up. The supply side theory would say that prices will go down. Now, in the early 1980s, tax rates were cut, and inflation declined, so that sounds supply side-ish. But in fact, initially, what was causing inflation to go down was the monetary contraction, and that actually caused a recession. So the the supply side story of the 1980s would be we had this, something like this happen. But the Keynesian story, which I think fits a little better with the facts, would be that, whoops, we'll put Y here. The Keynesian story of the early years of the Reagan administration, since we had a recession, is that we just had that even though taxes were cut, and that should have raised aggregate demand, the contractionary monetary policy more than offset it, and so you actually had a decline in demand. So anyway, that's I guess the main point to get across about supply side economics is this notion that tax cuts can increase aggregate supply. I think most economists would agree that there are policies that can increase supply, but that those are policies that make the economy more efficient. So better regulation, often deregulation, tax reform, where you eliminate inefficient loopholes and cut rates, those would be things that would shift supply to the right. And economists, when they agree on policies that would make sense from a supply side, they tend to be very unanimous in their opinion about the desirability of those policies. And often when they most agree, politicians won't listen to them. And that's what another economist who was talking about the 1980s, a guy named Alan Blinder, called this Murphy's Law of economic policy, which is that when economists of left and right agree on something, the politicians don't listen. But when economists voice controversial things, and what Blinder had in mind was this Laffer curve idea, when economists voice controversial things that there's no consensus on and there's not very good proof of, that's the type of thing that politicians latch on to. So that's his Murphy's Law of economic policy. And I think that's everything I could possibly say about supply-side economics. And hopefully you're not ending up like the students in Ben Stein's lecture at from Ferris Bueller's Day Off.